Father, we're mindful that everything we have that's good has come from you. And we're grateful, Father, for the blessing of living in a land where good things can happen because of our forefathers and their planning and their awareness of what good government is and what it is not. We're thankful, Lord, for our OPAC group because we learn more from week to week. Things we need to know about what's going on in our society and in our government, even in our homes. So the program today, we pray you'll bless, that we might be open-hearted, open-eared, and you'll accomplish your purposes because we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Let's talk about the election results. I put a slide up there on that as well. So this were the election results yesterday, Senate District 27 up in the Panhandle and Woodward. Now, Casey Murdoch took in 2,181 votes. Now, notice what the rest of the votes did. Your other top two vote getters were Travis Templin and Carolyn McClarty. They were the two that were fairly conservative, and they split the vote. And then there were three other candidates that all together, or maybe two, no, I think three other, but all the others were pretty much irrelevant. Together, they only took in 1,018 votes. So when I look at this, I see that 67% of the people in that district voted against Murdoch. They absolutely, positively did not want Murdoch. By a 2-to-1 margin, more than twice the people did not want Murdoch as wanted Murdoch, and yet he's going to be their next senator. So that is a disastrous result, one that we could have predicted with multiple good conservatives in the race. The problem is there should never be an election take place in this state where someone gets elected with less than 51% of the vote. That's an absolute travesty. It's immoral. It is wrong, flat wrong. And that has got to change. We cannot keep putting rhinos in office when clearly that's not what the people want. They're going to get exactly the opposite of what they voted for in this situation, which is a real shame because there were so many good candidates in that race. So this session, we've got to run a bill or a resolution or something. Someone at least needs to sponsor it so that we can talk about it and start putting pressure on there to do something different. Of course, if we elected somebody like Dan Fisher, he'd be all over that. We have a governor right now who stands up and says, I demand a tax increase, and I'm going to veto anything that isn't a tax increase. And then she sticks by her guns and does it. Just whips them. Whoosh. You will do what I say. Whoosh. And they say, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. And they try to do what she says. But imagine if we had a righteous guy up there having the same stance, saying, you will cut taxes, we will have fair elections, we will do things righteously and rightly, or I'm not signing it. That's why it's so important to have a righteous leader at the top. So that was disappointing but predictable. Okay. Anybody else have any comments about that? Everybody write a thank you note to Carolyn. Thank her for running. And Travis. They were doing the right thing, trying their best. Next week, our speaker here is going to be Mike Biggs. He is the teaching elder and pastor at Christ the King Church in Norman, and he's going to talk about God's calling of his people to civil and political duty. That'll be our presentation next Wednesday here. That takes us to our topic today, which is looking at the real history and character of General Robert E. Lee. Our speaker today is the one, the only Steve Byas, who is a co-editor of the Oklahoma Constitution newspaper. He's also a history professor at Randall University. And he is a writer for the New American Magazine, where he does excellent research and exposés for that magazine. So I was super excited to have Steve with us today. Everyone, please welcome Steve Byas.
Thank you. No relation there. But back at after the Civil War, and for many years after that, Robert E. Lee was certainly the most revered person in the South. You have to blame somebody when things go wrong. So most Southerners blame Jefferson Davis, and so his reputation, it took a few years to kind of be rehabilitated, so to speak. But Robert E. Lee, he was always great. And just a few years after the war between the states, there was a bridge in southern Mississippi where this guy was going to commit suicide. He's going to jump off the bridge. And so these people were watching this guy, and so somebody decided to go. He didn't want to see somebody kill himself. So he gets out there as close to him as he can on the bridge, and he says, "Sir," he says, "you don't want to do this. Think about your family." And the guy said, "Well, I ain't got no family." And then he thought a minute. He says, "Well, sir, think about your religion." And he said, "I don't believe in that stuff." And he thought a minute. He said, "Well, think about Robert E. Lee." And the guy goes, "Who the blankety blank is Robert E. Lee?" So he wound up jumping, as you can imagine. And some people in southern Mississippi to this day think he may have been pushed. Okay. Robert E. Lee, Confederate General Patrick Cleburne, died many years before the rise of the Taliban. But Cleburne did accurately predict Taliban-like efforts to alter the history of the Civil War. And I quote him, "Surrender means that the history of this heroic struggle will be written by our enemy, that our youth will be trained by Northern school teachers, will learn from Northern school books their version of the war, will be impressed by all the influences of history and education, to regard our gallant dead as traitors and our maimed veterans as fit subjects for derision." End quote. Now, what Cleburne did not realize, that this assault would target the common foundations of America, and that's really what this is about. They're attacking people like Stonewall Jackson, Stan Wadey, Robert E. Lee. And then the next thing, and they've already started doing this to some extent, but it's going to get a lot more, people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others of the founding fathers. No person identified with the Confederacy, as I said, has been more admired than Robert E. Lee. But I recall last year, and of course OU is going to the Rose Bowl this year. Last year OU went to the Sugar Bowl, and my wife and I went down there to the Sugar Bowl, and we decided to take a tour of the city on one of these double-decker buses and everything, and see the Big Easy, as they call it. And in the middle of our tour, this tour guide, we go by the statue of Robert E. Lee there in New Orleans, and he starts in a 1-minute complete rant about how horrible a human being Robert E. Lee was, that he was a slave-owning dude and stuff like this. My wife had to restrain me and everything. It's a good thing OU's not going back to the Sugar Bowl this year, because I could kind of slip out and do something about it. But when Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia on April 9th, 1865, both men were former slave owners. Both had freed their slaves, expressing disdain for the institution. Yet one man graces the $50 Federal Reserve note, while the other, Lee, is seen as a fit object for scorn. Some even go so far as to even attack his reputation as a military man. This is despite, Lee's victories were numerous. He won more battles than he lost. He was always outnumbered. And his triumph at Chancellorsville, for example, is still regarded as one of the greatest military feats in military history. He was outnumbered 2-1, and that battle plan that he used was studied by Norman Schwarzkopf, who used a variation of that in the Persian Gulf War, because he'd learned it at West Point. And he was still winning victories until the final months of the war. They finally just ran out of men, is basically what happened. But and some say, I concede that more or less, most of the time, he was a great military mind. But they always point out one thing as an example of his poor generalship, Gettysburg. And they say, hindsight's always 20/20, but they criticize Pickett's charge. But historian Philip Thomas Tucker, I've got his book on Pickett's charge, and I quote him, "Endlessly derided by historians, Lee's decision to unleash his attack at Gettysburg was his only realistic one. because this was the Confederacy's last chance to win the war in one decisive stroke. See, Lee understood that they were going to eventually lose this war if they didn't win it. By 1863, that was pretty obvious what was going to happen. Quite simply, based on careful calculation, instead of a stereotypical view that they say like he was a gambler's recklessness or something like this, Lee correctly targeted the weakest point in Meade's line, a weak spot distinguished by a copse of trees located at a high point along the open cemetery ridge. In short, he says, quote, Lee correctly calculated in striking at exactly that right place and that right time while utilizing a bold battle plan. This was as brilliant as it was innovative. Tucker argues that if other military officers in Lee's army, such as James Longstreet and Jeb Stuart, had performed as they should have, Lee's army might very well have marched into Washington, D.C. and dictated peace terms to Abraham Lincoln. But for one thing, anyway, I could go through the whole deal about Gettysburg, but if Longstreet had done his duty the first day, there wouldn't have been a Pickett's charge. And if Stuart had done right in getting around, he was supposed to hit from behind, but he didn't get there. And so they lost. But of course, the attacks upon Lee's military leadership are more likely based upon the common misconceptions about the origins and purpose of the war itself. The case against honoring Lee seems to be that the Civil War was fought to abolish slavery, and since Lee was the most important military leader on the side that was supposedly fighting to keep slavery, no monument should remain honoring him, even in his native Virginia. Slavery was certainly a source of friction, and it contributed to the decision of 7 southern states, Alabama and Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, to secede from the Union. But there were other factors that are not as talked about because that's just a little too, complicated for most people. For example, the tariff almost caused secession 30 years earlier in South Carolina. It had nothing to do with slavery. And secession was not just a Southern idea. During the last days of the War of 1812, there was a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, where they came very close to voting to secede the New England states from the Union. And they didn't like, it's hard for us to think about that now, but at that time in American history, a lot of other states resented Virginia and their influence in the country. Now, after 7 states left the Union in late 1860 and early 1861, 8 states where slavery was legal remained in the Union. Now think about this. If the war had really been fought to abolish slavery, one wonders why Lincoln did not call for an invasion of those 8 states as well. But Lincoln did not call for the abolition of slavery when he asked for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he called the rebellion in 7 states. Even after the war was more than a year old, he wrote Horace Greeley. And he said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Now, enlistments filled the ranks of the Union, made up of men who answered the call to, quote, save the Union. With modern insistence that the war was waged to end slavery, this motivation is either forgotten or is kind of passed off as mere sentimentality. We love the Union, we don't have to break up, all this. But this motivation to save the Union was grounded in the very reason the Union was created in 1776, 1775, 1776. That was a military alliance to break off from the British Empire. They couldn't have won each one by themselves. In the 1830s, Daniel Webster proclaimed on the floor of the Senate a generation before the Civil War the famous words, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." He didn't need to explain himself. This was a widely held viewpoint, North and South, at the time, because the thinking was if the Union broke up, they'd be easy pickings for a foreign power. Lee opposed secession for Virginia while also opposing an invasion of the 7 states that had chosen to leave the Union. He resigned from the United States Army rather than lead a subjugation of those 7 states. Yet, when Lincoln made his call for volunteers, Virginia and other states, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, had to make their decision. And they weren't going to be part of an invasion of 7 other states. So they left the Union as well. Their decision had nothing to do with slavery. And then there were 3 other states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware. But somebody challenged me and I didn't put Delaware. It was pretty meaningless. I think there were 12 slaves in Delaware, you know. But anyway, 3 other states did not secede, but eventually provided soldiers for both sides. If the war had been fought to end slavery, they would have left the Union as well, don't you think? If that was the issue. But after Virginia's secession, Lee felt he had no choice but to offer his services to the Confederate States. It was his duty. He said that one of his famous quotes is, "Duty is the most sublime word in the English language." As the war dragged on, with Confederate troops under Lee and other brilliant military minds winning more battles than they lost, it began to look as though the Confederate States of America would truly become an independent nation. By the fall of 1862, France and Great Britain were poised to recognize this as a fact. Lincoln was desperate, so he took a desperate measure. He could have told the British that they should not recognize the independence of the southern states because they don't have a right to secede from the Union. But that probably would have been met with derision from the British, who would have said that serves you right, considering what had happened in 1776. So, since the British and French had abolished slavery only a few decades earlier, Lincoln could have undoubtedly kept both countries from recognizing Southern independence if he had made it a war on slavery. But had he done that, then he would have faced massive desertions from the Union Army. And logic would have dictated, well, if you're fighting to end slavery, then you better invade Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky. Lincoln's solution was to, what we say, thread the needle. He issued an executive order ending slavery in states still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863 as a war measure, leaving slavery untouched in those states were under Union control. Now, then they battle late. I won't go into the whole deal about the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, but Lincoln decided to call it a victory. Okay, we could sit here and argue about what it was, but the reality is that Lincoln had no constitutional authority to end slavery anywhere, but his Emancipation Proclamation proposed to leave slavery untouched in areas that recognized his presidency and end it where he had no troops to enforce it. So it was really a kind of a meaningless thing. But what it has done is it has caused people today to think this was what the war was fought for, to end slavery. Now, this is a slander on the hundreds of thousands of Confederate soldiers who fought in the war. Less than 5% of Confederate soldiers owned any slaves at all. And it is illogical that those soldiers made that charge across the field at Gettysburg on Pickett's charge and other places like the Battle of Franklin and places like that to keep some rich guy's slave down the road. I mean, that's just illogical. So why did they fight? To repel an invading army, of course. What would you do if some foreign army came into the United States? We would fight. And that's why they did it. That's the reason Lee fought. He said he would have been content for the Union to continue even if it meant every slave in the South would go free. Yet Lee has been condemned as fighting to keep human beings in bondage. The truth is that Lee denounced slavery long before the war began. In a letter to his wife in 1856, writing from Camp Brown in Texas, he said, "I believe in this enlightened age there are few who will not acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil." Now, some challenge what Lee said that wanted to detract from him. They'll say, well, yeah. But later on in that letter, he wrote, "The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically." End quote. Critics twist those words in an effort to have Lee arguing that it was better for a black person to be a slave in America than to live free in Africa. But this betrays, well, I'll put it in a nice way, a lack of understanding on the part of those critics as to the condition of American slaves when their ancestors were in Africa. The slave trade, which Lee denounced on every ground, had ended in America over a half century before the war. So there were no persons being brought to America from Africa in Lee's day. And the ugly truth is that almost every single person brought to America was a slave in Africa. See, how did these people get to be slaves? Well, one tribe would beat another tribe and they'd take prisoners. They thought it was better as an economic decision rather than just killing them all, make slaves out of them. So when the traders come along the African coast, they have a commodity in their mind to trade, and that's what happened. After visiting, you probably are not expecting Muhammad Ali to back up what Robert E. Lee said, but he did. Muhammad Ali was asked what he thought of the continent of Africa after he had visited it. And he responded that he was certainly glad. He said, "One thing I do know, I'm glad my ancestors got on that boat." All his views weren't pro-slavery, but it was another way of saying what Lee had said a century earlier. I'm glad my ancestors came from England and Scotland and Ireland and Germany and France and various other places. Once in America, they were often introduced to Christianity, which Lee and his fellow Christians believed led to their eternal salvation. Lee told his wife, "How long their subjection may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence." He did not know how long slavery would continue, but rather it was up to God. But he did pray for the final abolition of slavery. To fully understand Lee's words, in which he accepts the will of God in all things, one must realize Robert E. Lee was a devout Christian. Throughout the war, almost every military dispatch or private letter he wrote has allusions to his trust in God. The universal witness is that Lee never drank, never used tobacco, and never used profanity. At West Points, he never had a single demerit. He took a generous attitude toward his enemies. In another letter, he spoke of the murderous abolitionist John Brown, whom Lee had captured at Harper's Ferry in 1859. He said, "I'm glad we did not have to kill him." I'm going to add here, Robert E. Lee is a more generous man than I am on that. Years after the war, I didn't know if anybody got that, a Union veteran told a story of Lee's generous spirit. This Union veteran, a ball had shattered his left leg, and as Confederate soldiers passed by, he recognized General Lee. The man shouted taunts at Lee, and his men shouting hurrah for the Union. At that, Lee stopped his horse, dismounted, and walked toward the soldier. The soldier recalled, "I confess at first I thought he meant to kill me. But as he came up, he looked down at me with such a sad expression upon his face that all fear left me, extended his hand to me, grasping mine firmly and looking right in my eyes, said, 'My son, I hope you will be well soon.'" William Jones wrote of another similar incident. "One day in the autumn of 1869, I saw General Lee standing at his gate talking to a humbly clad man who turned off evidently delighted with his interview just as I came up. After exchanging salutations, the general pleasantly said, pointing to the retreating form, 'That is one of our soldiers who is in necessary circumstances.' I took it for granted that it was a veteran Confederate and asked to what command he belonged. The general pleasantly added, 'He fought for the other side, but we must not remember that against him now.'" Later, Jones found that Lee had given the old Union veteran some money and a kind word. Still, even Lee's emancipation of his own slaves has generated criticism, arguing that he showed anything but Christian charity to him. And they say, well, why didn't he free his slaves immediately when he inherited them from his late father-in-law in 1857? Now, his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis, left his slaves to his daughter and his son-in-law Lee, making Lee the executor of the estate. In his article for the Atlantic magazine, "The Myth of the Kindly General Lee," Adam Serwer, a strongly left-wing writer, distorts the historical record concerning this whole thing. In the article, Lee is pictured as a man who delayed their emancipation and even sold slaves for profit. The truth of the matter, I know you're going to find it hard to believe a writer for the Atlantic might not have told the whole truth, but the truth of the matter is that that Custis' will made it practically impossible for Lee to free them immediately. As Douglas Southall Freeman wrote, the will contained a provision that only when Custis' debts were all paid were the slaves to be emancipated. Custis hoped this would happen within 5 years. The immediate trouble, Freeman wrote, was that Mr. Custis left more than $10,000 of debt and virtually no money with which to operate the estate. Now, for somebody like Charlie Meadows, $10,000 is no big deal today. But this was back before the Federal Reserve had. $10,000 was a whole lot of money back at the time of the Civil War. The Arlington estate was run down. Lee was forced to dig into his own modest financial resources to even save the estate. It should be noted that the sale of Arlington would have included the slaves as well, so that was not an option. And Lee refused to take that option. In other words, if he had sold it, the slaves would have gone with him and they'd still been in bondage. Lee had to take leave from the army in an effort to save the plantation. Granted by General Winfield Scott, who said Lee is the very best soldier I ever saw on the field. Rather than sell off his slaves, Lee hired some of them out in order to raise the necessary funds to pay the debts. Freeman wrote, the demand for servants was so limited in Northern Virginia and the return was so small that he was compelled to send some of the Arlington Negroes to work in Eastern Virginia. Now, I could go on with this, but I hope you see the point that as soon as Lee was able to get the debts paid off, he then freed his slaves. And the irony of the date that he freed his slaves is January 2nd, 1863. Now, what's significant about that? That's one day after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. And he had filed the manumission in Henrico County. Now, why would these people distort this record I just told you? Well, Serwer, the guy that wrote this stuff, that like Lee didn't want to really free his slaves and all that, he delayed it and so forth and so on. Let me tell you some of the other things that Serwer has written for. Mother Jones, American Prospect, BuzzFeed, and MSNBC. In short, consider the source. Lee was president of Washington College after the war between the states, and Serwer even uses this to attack Lee as indifferent to the mistreatment of slaves. He quotes a liberal historian who blames Lee for what some of his students did while he was a president at the college. According to Pryor, Serwer wrote, students at Washington formed their own chapter of the KKK. And there were at least 2 attempted lynchings by Washington students during Lee's tenure. Well, you know, it seems a bit unfair to blame the college president for the misbehavior of some of his students. If that is the standard, almost every college president in this country would have something to answer for. Knowing Lee's actions and other matters, it is likely that Lee did not approve of rapes and lynchings. For example, Lee displayed kindness toward ex-slaves, not violence. Writing in the Confederate Veteran magazine, August of 1905, Colonel Braun of Charleston, West Virginia, recalled having been present at St. Paul's Cathedral in Richmond, Virginia in June of 1865. This is 2 months after he surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia. It was Communion Day, and when the minister was ready to administer the Holy Communion, a Negro in the church arose and advanced to the communion table. He was tall, well-dressed, and black. This was a great surprise and shock to the communicants and others present. Its effect upon the communicants was startling, and for several moments they retained their seats in solemn silence and did not move, being deeply chagrined at this attempt to inaugurate the new regime. The minister seemed embarrassed. Brown continued, General Robert E. Lee was present, and ignoring the action and presence of the Negro, arose in his usual dignified and self-possessed manner, walked up to the aisle of the chancel rail, and reverently knelt down to partake of the communion just next to the Negro. This lofty conception of duty by General Lee under such provoking and irritating circumstances had a magical effect upon the other communicants, including this writer, who then went forward to the communion table. Besmirching the memory of General Lee by smearing him as a slave-owning racist who led a bloody rebellion to preserve slavery that cost over 600,000 American lives is despicable. Edward Smith, Director of American Studies at American University in Washington, D.C., and the co-director of the Civil War Institute, who contends the above story is absolutely true, wrote in National Geographic News on September 7, 2001, today, and deservingly so, Lee is honored throughout the country. It was certainly so at the time of his death in 1870. Americans North and South at that time knew Lee was a great man deserving of admiration. For example, upon his death, the New York Herald wrote, on a quiet autumn morning, in the land which he loved so well and served so faithfully, the spirit of Robert E. Lee left the clay which it had so much ennobled and traveled out of this world into the great and mysterious land. Here in the North, forgetting that time was when the sword of Robert Edward Lee was drawn against us, forgetting and forgiving all the years of bloodshed and agony, we have long since ceased to look upon him as the Confederate leader, but have claimed and recorded his triumphs as our own, have extolled his virtues as reflecting upon us, for Robert Edward Lee was an American, and the great nation which gave him birth would be today unworthy of such a son if she regarded him lightly. And I would add that my thoughts I agree with the New York Herald. There's other things probably the successors, that I wouldn't agree, but I think they had it right on the money at that. And that's my story on Robert E. Lee.